In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about what defines reality.
How would you define reality? If you had to come up with a definition of what constituted real, how would you go about doing it? And I would say the way the West does this, there's a schizophrenic element to it, a split element. There's an incoherence in it, and I haven't heard anyone else make this argument, so if you can figure out some reason why it's stupid, then let me know. So think about it this way, like our basic presumptions about the world are materialistic, right? Now, and I would say that those materialistic assumptions were basically laid down at the beginning of the scientific endeavor, and so that would be about the time of Bacon and Descartes. And so, because they sort of laid the foundations for modern science. And there's some rules about what things are in reality, and the rules are something like, well, things are made out of littler things, and then if you go all the way down to the level where the littlest thing possible is, well, that's where you find the fundamental constituent elements of reality. And so and matter is detectable by the senses, and it's intersubjectively detectable. So you can detect something with your senses fundamentally, or with the extension of your senses. You can describe how you went about detecting it. Other people can duplicate that, and then they can report what they detect, and if the reports are similar, then we assume that that thing is real. So in some sense it's what our senses already do, right? Because our senses triangulate in a sense. So how do you figure out if something's real? Well, if you can see it, you know, that's pretty good. But it's better if you can see it and hear it. And it's better yet if you can see it and hear it and touch it. And maybe it's better if you can see it and hear it and touch it and taste it, and so forth. And you know, we've evolved these sensory systems that are quite different from a qualitative perspective. And if they all report the same thing, then we believe we have a pretty reasonable chance of actually believing that that thing is there. And then with science, we've actually extended that capacity because we don't just use the senses of one person, we use our senses in a rigorous and collective manner, and that reports to us the nature of what we've come to call the objective world. And then we say, well, accurate descriptions of the objective world are true. It's like, you know, that's a good theory, and you can also certainly see its objective utility. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. It's pragmatic utility, because when you play by the rules of science, it appears that your power expands, right? So that's another reason why we think it's true. You run through these routines, and then all of a sudden you could do things you couldn't do before. And that's a different criteria of truth, right? That's more like a criteria of usefulness, and a practical usefulness, because you would think too that, and this is why Jung thought that science was actually embedded inside a narrative, in a deeper narrative. You know, we wouldn't be doing science if we didn't think it was useful for something, right? And then you might think, well, useful for what? And then, well, what would you say? Maybe you suffer less because of science, maybe you live longer because of science, maybe you find life more interesting, you could do a more diverse range of things, whatever. We have made the decision that the utility of science justifies the endeavor, but that's a different criteria, right? The utility of something. And you could debate the utility of science from a Darwinian perspective, because you could easily say, well, here's an example. There was a book written a while ago by an ex-KGB officer, and he was talking about biological warfare labs in the Soviet Union. And he claimed to have worked in a biological warfare lab where the goal was to cross Ebola with smallpox. Now, Ebola, which you all know about, isn't very contagious. You have to really be in contact with someone who has Ebola to catch it. But smallpox, that's contagious. So if you could get the two things working together, you would have a disease that's basically 100% fatal, and it would be, you could distribute it in aerosol form, which is sort of the dream of any biological weapons maker. Now, they never really managed it, but you know, it's kind of an interesting idea, right? And had it turned out, and there were no people left, then we'd have to say that our notion about the utility of science turned out to be colossally wrong from a Darwinian perspective. And you know, you might say the same thing about hydrogen bombs, for example, or maybe you might say the same thing about computers, because you know, it seems to me quite unlikely that human beings in their present form are going to be around 200 years in the future. You know, with the rate of the growth of computer intelligence, the probability that we'll become something biological and mechanical together seems to me to be virtually certain. We're certainly headed in that direction. So anyways, yep, question? So we kind of have a definition of reality from a materialist perspective. Now there's a few problems with that, right? One of the problems is that when you get down to the fundamental elements of matter, they turn out not to be very much like matter at all. They turn out to be these weird quantum processes and entities that appear to be tangled up with consciousness in some way that no one can understand, and certainly display all sorts of properties that aren't evident at the macro level. So, you know, the formal job of reductionism, which is or one element of reductionism, because there's many elements of reductionism, is that you explain the complex by the simple, and, you know, for a long time as we went deeper into the microstructure of things, it did appear in some sense to be getting simpler, but then when we went down to the quantum level, it all of a sudden got incredibly weird, and no one really knows what to do about that. Now, I'm not going to introduce quantum thinking into this discussion, because, you know, every weirdo with a crockpot theory immediately does that, and it's a very dangerous thing to do. I'm just pointing out that we didn't expect for the nature of reality to qualitatively transform as we investigated the microstructure, but that's what happened. So, okay, all of that aside, the idea that that there are facts about material reality and that those facts are true is a very, very powerful idea. However, we don't pursue it because the rationale for pursuing that truth is based on truths that are different from the truths that the process itself reveals. So, you know, and I think, you know, you might well agree, hypothetically, that perhaps investigating how to combine Ebola with smallpox is not really a good idea from a perfect idea from a scientific perspective. But it seems not unreasonable to assume that there's a broader perspective from which that idea probably isn't for the best. You know, now a pure scientist, there isn't such a thing, but if there was, might say it doesn't matter because all facts are equal, because facts don't have value. You know, they're not valenced, so all facts are equal. But of course you can't live like all facts are equal, because there's a trillion facts, and if you don't have some mechanism to zero you in on a subset of relevant facts, it's like you're immobilized, you know. You're just flooded by information. I think something like that probably happens to people in the initial stages of schizophrenia. So they can't distinguish, everything becomes relevant. That's a bad situation. So you know, you're stuck with a subset of facts anyways, and there are reasons that you choose the subset of facts that you choose, and those reasons aren't grounded in a materialist philosophy, and they can't be, at least not in any simple way. Okay, so maybe, you know, hopefully that's a coherent argument.